So thanks for the invitation again. My name is Matt Metz. I'm a research associate in Yellowstone. I primarily work really just inside the park. And I've been in this, working in the system for about the last 2 decades. Maybe similar to John, at least, I struggled with the title for my talk, but I decided to just focus on density-dependent changes in wolf predation within the complex system of northern Yellowstone, which is what I'll spend the majority of the time talking about. None of my, okay, weird. Okay, now everything's working, nothing was working. Okay, so wolves were reintroduced, of course, into Yellowstone National Park between 1995 and 1997. And this was the end result of a long process of planning that included modeling exercises to look at what the effect of wolves on ungulate populations may be within Yellowstone. And these models often used ideas of density-dependent predation that I'll talk about today. And importantly, this occurred, as others have highlighted so far, both John and Arthur, when the northern Yellowstone elk herd was essentially at an all-time high. Simultaneous or just following that reintroduction, the National Park Service solicited the opinion of prominent ecologists at the time and asked for what they thought the effect of wolves may be in the system and how best to research the topic. And one of the things that they stated is that they didn't believe that really the impacts of wolves in the system would even be operative for about 2 decades. And so I'm going to focus really on northern Yellowstone, and northern Yellowstone is defined by the wintering range of the northern Yellowstone elk herd, and it's approximately 1,500 square kilometers, and about 2/3 of that is within Yellowstone National Park, and 1/3 outside. And the difference, really, as has been alluded to, is the different top-down forces that may be operating within these 2 portions of the northern range. Outside of Yellowstone is the only place where there's human hunting. Large carnivore species, here depicted wolves, cougars, grizzly bears. There's also black bears and coyotes are both inside and outside of the park, though they tend to be at higher densities inside the park. And often we're thinking about this in the context of their relationship with elk, but it's important to highlight that elk are just one of 8 ungulates that use Yellowstone. And the other 2 primary players on the northern range are bison and then mule deer. So I'm going to focus now on these 4 potential top-down forces and just give you a little background on them. So first, hunter opportunities and harvests are often managed to be density dependent. As Arthur alluded to earlier, when wolves were introduced, there was an intention to not allow the elk population to continue growing and in fact to decrease it. And one of the things that human hunters do is that we tend to kill adult females proportional to their availability. And so I'm going to show you a slide here that first have you focus on these blue bars here, which is the age structure, the average age structure of female elk within the population. You see this skewing where you have a decline in the frequency of particular aged individual as you age. The black line shows you the probability that an adult female elk is pregnant. And what you see is it's basically high until individuals are about 10 or 11 years old, and then you see a steep decline in the probability of pregnancy in each year. Now, if we look at human hunters, you see the red bars here. You see basically it mirrors these blue bars of how elk are present within the population. Now, this is a really big difference in that between wolves. And so wolves instead focus on these older individuals among adults. So this does not include calves. There's also a spike in calves here. And so this is one way that wolves may have less of an effect than one would expect because they're tending to kill these individuals that are not pregnant. And so, and this is kind of something that drives wolf predation patterns. They're generally driven by something that makes the prey vulnerable to them. So they're often related to nutritional condition and then age, as we display here. And in many ways, wolves are lethal, but they're also a low success predator. They frequently encounter elk, and they make kills relatively infrequently, especially from kind of an individual basis from the elk. In comparison, we also have mountain lions on the landscape who are lethal and a higher success predator. And then among adult prey, their vulnerability is less influenced by prey age and nutritional condition than wolves. This is some more recent work from the Northern Yellowstone system, and I'll just have you focus on the bar on the far right, and really just want you to take home that the green and the tan are not quite as skewed to this older individual. So these are individuals that are 10 or greater in this slide. And then lastly, as Arthur was talking about, we have bears present in the system. They're of course an omnivore with great variation in their diet. In Yellowstone, ungulates are an important part of their diet, and elk are the primary ungulate that bears kill. Bears also are a dominant scavenger from other predator species kills or maybe other carcasses that appear on the landscape. And they're a lethal predator on neonates, as Arthur talked about. And so here is from that same study that Arthur showed from the Northern Range of Yellowstone, where the study took place from 2003 to 2005. And grizzly bears killed per individual about 2.5 times that of wolves and about 3 times that of cougars. And so this is thought to be really an important driver then in calf survival. And one way that this was looked at was across many studies across the Rocky Mountain West, looking at neonate survival, so calf survival until they were 3 months old. And what you see here is on the y-axis, you see neonate survival. And on the x-axis, cause-specific mortality rate. And so the line for ursids, bears here, you can see the steep negative decline. So as bears kill more of the neonate elk calf population, neonate survival declines. For many other species, we don't see this sharp decline. And so for these reasons, bear predation is thought to maybe be one of the key drivers of neonate survival. But I don't want to give the impression that wolves don't kill calves. Calves make up an important part of wolf diet. So here, starting in May, we measure predation for 5 months of the year, consistently in early and late winter, less so in May, June, and July. It is, as Arthur alluded to, logistically challenging and expensive. But this shows here the proportion of calves among wolf-killed elk. And you see that as calves are coming onto the landscape in mid to late May, they're making up about 1/4 of wolves' diet. By June and July, elk calves make up about 70% of the wolf-killed elk. About 40% in early winter, meaning mid-November to mid-December, and about 25% in late winter. And so what we have less of an understanding on really is the influence of this winter period, how wolves are influencing overwinter calf survival. So a lot of that is really some background information, and I want to just take a step back, and now I'm going to just focus more exclusively on wolves for most of the remainder of the talk. Now, again, when we return to this document that was created in the fall of 1995, and just highlight that one of the ways that these authors thought was important to study the potential effect of wolves in Northern Yellowstone was through thinking about density-dependent predation. And what I mean by density-dependent predation here is just we have ungulate abundance on the x-axis and some predation metric on the y-axis. And we're interested in how this predation metric varies with ungulate abundance. And the 3 predation metrics that I'm going to talk to you about are first, diet composition, so just the proportion of a particular prey among wolves' diet. Second is kill rate, or how frequently wolves kill prey. And the last is predation rate, the statistic that John mentioned, which is the proportion or percent of the prey population removed by a predator. In our case, we're really thinking about wolf predation rate. And I'm going to pull a little bit of a magic trick here on the x-axis and change ungulate abundance to time in our multi-prey system. And this works out okay for us because if we think about the relationship between ungulate abundance and time, meaning year, from the time that wolves have been reintroduced, we've seen this figure before of how the elk population has changed. Here I'm referring to this as total, meaning the elk population both within and outside of Yellowstone National Park on the Northern Range in the winter. A portion of this population is estimated to winter in Yellowstone National Park, showing a similar trend through time, a little bit of a divergence in more recent years. And one thing you'll notice here is that the elk population outside of the park has remained relatively similar through the time since the time that wolves have been reintroduced. But often overlooked in our system when we try to simplify it to just an elk system is that there are these other prey available or in the system. And one is bison, who's shown a dramatic increase through time, really over the last 15 years or so, most dramatically, to where now the Northern Range population of bison numbers over 4,000. And then we know less about the deer population, and most of these deer in the winter are outside of the park, but you see numbers put out often around 1,800. I personally have no idea how that is varied through time. And so I'm now going to talk about just an overarching question of how wolf predation metrics have changed through time, and if those have changed in ways predicted by classic density-dependent theory. And so to do so, I'm going to just present data from early and late winter, again, this mid-November to mid-December, the month of March. And this data is collected through 3 independent methods in which we detect wolves detecting or feeding on carcasses. So we use an airplane, ground-based observation, and we search GPS locations of wolves. We do this independently so that we can put this into a mark recapture framework and estimate carcasses that we're also missing through our effort. Again, I'm going to focus on these 3 different metrics, and I'm going to look at how their dynamics have changed through time, beginning here with diet. And so I'm going to just orient you to this figure to begin with, where on the y-axis, you see the proportion of Northern Range wolf diet. On the x-axis, year. You'll see 3 different colors for the species. I'm going to begin with early winter, and I'm going to calculate this proportion from the number of wolf-killed prey. And what we see is a general decline in elk through time, with a corresponding increase in other species, particularly deer. In late winter, we see a very similar pattern. And so now I'm just going to take this figure on the right and move it to the next screen. And I'm going to change from the number of wolf-killed prey and instead base this off of the biomass of acquired prey, meaning both prey that wolves kill and that they scavenge. And what you see is a very different relationship, one in which bison are really have become a dominant part of wolves' diet in northern Yellowstone, and deer really falls down due to their small size. And so we've seen a density-dependent shift in time and in the shift of the importance of elk and bison. So next, I'm going to talk about kill rate and how that's varied through time. And kill rate, just again to make it maybe a bit clearer, kill rate is some measure of prey per predator per unit of time. And again, to orient you to the figure, we again have early and late winter. The top row will be elk, the bottom row will be bison. In red, you'll see wolf kills, and in blue, you'll see scavenging. And here we're thinking about the biomass of prey still, so I'm just taking over what we just looked at. If we start with elk, you see that this is mostly wolves are mostly getting elk through killing them. You see relatively little change through time, if anything, a very small decline in more recent years. Unsurprisingly, you don't see much change then in the contribution of bison, maybe a little bit of uptick again in the most recent years. And so this would not have been predicted by the changes in density. But in late winter, we see a much different story. We see a clear density-dependent response of how frequently wolves are killing elk. And that is, they're compensating for that in many ways through their acquisition of bison, and they're often doing this through scavenging bison in blue. And so again, just to quickly focus on elk here, these are these same relationships in biomass, but now I want to switch the perspective a little bit and change this to the number of prey. And the most important thing you're going to see here is really very little change at all in these relationships. But similar to John, breaking things up into 4 different periods here. And so I'm just orienting you to these 4 periods of about 6-year chunks, I think they were. And I'm going to show you these numbers here for these 4 different periods in both early and late winter. And right now you're going to see something that you really don't see much of a change. You still see, like, in early winter, kill rate stays essentially the same. In a late winter, this clear, relatively clear density dependent response. But I'm doing so to just orient you to this figure, because all elk are not the same. As we saw before, the wolves are selecting for older individuals. They may be selecting more for calves, less for cows. They tend to select for bulls. And so these individuals all contribute differently to future population growth. And so cows tend to be the most important segment of the elk population, then calves, and then bulls to whatever degree they have importance. And so again, I'm going to show you these columns of early and late winter. And remember that we saw no density dependent in kill rate during this early winter period. So in many ways, this is the more interesting time period to look at. And if you look at it in early winter for bulls, you see actually an opposite, it occurs opposite to what you would predict by density dependent theory. So kill rates were lowest at the very beginning when elk abundance was highest. However, for calves, we see signals of a density dependent response where kill rate on calves declined as did the elk population. And then we see a similar thing for cows, where you see this density dependent response and how it is that how frequently wolves are killing female elk. And so we see this density dependence in kill rate, but it was context dependent, season and prey demography. And so lastly, I'm just going to briefly talk about predation rate and how that has changed. And again, a reminder here is that predation rate is simply the number of prey killed by a predator population divided by their prey abundance. And so we've been focusing so far on how frequently wolves kill elk. And we've talked about the elk population, but I actually haven't shown you the wolf population, which I think is the longest I've ever gone in a talk without showing it. And so we see this change in the wolf population through time. And you can multiply how frequently wolves kill prey in each given year times their wolf abundance in that year, divide it by the elk population, and that's how we derive our predation rate. And so the predation rate here, I'm actually showing on the x-axis elk abundance as opposed to time. You see this kind of hump-shaped pattern as best we can identify it, which is quite a challenge. And this hump-shaped pattern is one that has a positive portion at lower abundances and a negative relationship as you move out to higher abundances. And this point where they come together is a point that you predict that wolves could be contributing to regulating the elk population. And so here we'd be predicting that the elk population would be regulated number of about 10,000, which is the number where we generally have seen the elk population grow to in some periods over the last 15 years before again declining. And so we also see density dependence and predation rate, suggesting that wolves are now a regulating force within northern Yellowstone. And so this is a departure from some of these earlier periods when wolves were reintroduced when elk abundance was high, but of course was a very important component to what we wanted to understand over the last 25 years to help guide our understanding of the system and management in the system. And so just to show you couple brief slides here on just the trajectory through time of this elk population. And here referencing the work that John talked about before, really we think that much of this early period, the decline in the elk population can be explained by human harvest as well as weather. And to what degree other cougars and bears may have contributed from the previous 30 years, is a bit of an unknown there. But in more recent years, really it's this cumulative effect of predators that is likely driving where elk abundance is able to kind of be at this time. And we seem to be in a much more stable point within the northern Yellowstone elk population, but of course stability in our world tends to be fairly fleeting. And so lastly, just, we often want to boil this down to just the simple wolves and elk and what is the influence of wolves. But as both Arthur and John have talked about, it's often quite a bit more complex than that. And the Yellowstone system, we're really just thinking about 2 species within this really complicated food web. So with that, I certainly just want to briefly thank this work is the result of many people's efforts through the year and funding sources. So thank you, and I can stop my screen share and take any questions.